And I remembered that the very first YFS event that I ever played a part in was also with Rosie Garthwaite, in a panel that we did on, I think it was to do with media bias. And it's still as present today. The first news story you remember hearing or reading, I really do think it can't have been Michael Jackson, because that was quite late. What about you, Ronnie?
For me, I didn't really pay attention to the news much when I was growing up. Living in Switzerland was like a different country for me. But I do remember a couple years back reading about Eurovision in the newspaper on the train here, and it was about Israel specifically, and I was a little shocked, but that's what I remember.
About Eurovision? That's
Yeah,
a good
it was
one.
supposed to be last week, the finals as well.
Eurovision was a big part of my childhood.
Was it really?
I haven't really watched it since. I'm not the biggest.
It's been a while here too, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's been a few minutes since 6:30, so I'd like to officially start this Youth Forum Switzerland in conversation with events. People will still be joining in, of course, but let's get it formally underway. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Fabrizio Frenner, and I will be your MC for this session titled Investigative Journalism for a New Reality. Now, I'm in grade 11 at the International School of Zug Lucerne, and I've been a member of the YFS series team for 1 year. Now, this evening's event is actually our 5th in our online series of discussions with key supporters of the Youth Forum. And as a team, we hope that our time together tonight represents a positive break from the recent pressures of the lockdown, and that we can give you, the audience, a chance to continue to interact with some of the leading change makers and inspiring experts from around the world. Now, tonight's guests happen to fit neatly into both of those categories and has truly become a real friend of the forum. It is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Rosie Garthwaite. Now, Ms. Garthwaite is a former officer in the British Army and currently a senior producer over at the BBC, but she also owns her own production company. Now, her reports are mainly focused on the Middle East, and she's also the author of How to Survive in a War Zone. With that out of the way, I'd like to hand it over to Ronnie, who'll be managing our call tonight and collecting audience questions. Ronnie?
Hi, Fabs. Thank you. So, hi. I'm Ronnie. I'm a 10th grade student at the International School of Zug and Lucerne, and I'll be managing tech and questions this afternoon. Please can I remind you to keep your mics off and muted for the first 45 minutes. Our call is also being recorded, so if you have an issue with being filmed, also please keep your cameras off. Otherwise, you're welcome to have it on, as it's great to see our audience. So the way this session will work is we have about 45 minutes together, during which Lucas will be leading the conversation with Rosie. Please feel free to use the chat box to share a question with me at any time during the conversation. All questions coming in will be anonymous when asked. After 45 minutes, we would like to invite anyone with an additional question to stay in the chat and ask it personally. Otherwise, you're free to leave the meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator and interviewer for this session, Lucas.
Well, thank you very much, Ronnie, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. It's so good to see you all. And of course, I'd like to welcome once again our guest this evening, the wonderful Rosie Garthwaite. Thank you for being here. I suppose my first question is, how are you? Where are you currently in lockdown? How's the global situation treating you?
I'm in London. I've been on a sort of extra level of lockdown because my dad needs full-time care, and we had to send the carers home because we just felt like it was too dangerous for them coming in on public transport. So we're now helping being the carers, taking it in turns, which means in between we have to be super isolated. But, you know, getting to know my local pavements very well and getting to spend some quality time with my folks. So that's, it's a good thing. And at the same time, I have a full-time job. Journalists are actually key workers in this situation. And my job is to inform the world, investigate what's going on in the Middle East related to coronavirus and other things that are going on. And so that's my kind of front line, whilst at the same time, you know, trying to do all of the other normal things that you have to do when you're living at home and always at home. So it's been an interesting balance.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point about journalists being key workers. I hadn't thought about it that way, but of course they are. Today's conversation is going to center around investigative journalism in the new digital world. and the new approach using open source intelligence, which we'll get onto a bit later, which is at the heart of what yourself and BBC Arabic have been working with. But first, I'd like to take a step back a little bit and ask you about your entry into journalism. What sparked your interest there?
Well, so Fabrizio mentioned I was in the army for a short time. That was something I did in between school and going to uni. It was something the British Army used to offer as a sort of gap year experience. It was quite an extreme experience, but it was an interesting one. And when I was in there, I met all of these really lovely people who 2 or 3 years later I was still friends with when I was in the final year at uni, feeling quite engaged in what was going on in Iraq. I don't know why. I had no particular connection with the Middle East, but I was hearing from my friends that they were already in Baghdad whilst I was preparing to go on a march, the biggest march that there had been in many, many years at that point, although they've now been superseded by the Brexit marches in the UK. But it was the biggest march for 20 years, the anti-Iraq war march, and I was on it. And at the same time, I knew that my friends who were in the SAS were already in Baghdad and said that the war had started, basically. And so I felt that the government had been lying to us, and I wanted to know what the hell was going on. And so a friend of mine, and this doesn't happen every day, but a friend of mine said, "Oh, I'm starting a newspaper in Baghdad. I hear you're interested. Do you want to come along?" And you know, my parents, bless their souls, somehow thought that that was an okay idea. And at the age of 22, I went off to Baghdad just after the war had finished and started working in a little newspaper called Baghdad Bulletin, which was my start as a journalist. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So you, just after graduating from Oxford, you were in Iraq as a freelance journalist, and then you start working for the Baghdad Bulletin. You've gone on to work for Al Jazeera and the BBC in the Middle East, and Media Dante, your production company, has worked in the Middle East as well. What continues to sort of renew your fascination with that area of the world?
I think immediately I was so shocked by the difference when I arrived in Iraq between what I'd seen on the news, the portrayal of Iraq as this sort of place of disaster, versus this extremely beautiful, highly educated, but extremely beautiful landscape. It was like a city, as it still is, a city of palm trees. It's absolutely stunning. You've never seen anything like it. Obviously ruined a lot over the last nearly 20 years now, but it's still a beautiful place where lots of magical enclaves and things that you wouldn't expect they were there. So I was shocked by that, the portrayal. And then I was also taken aback by how my own preconceptions of how the people would be were very different to how I found them. You know, the young people like myself were so engaged and global and educated, and we just had these amazing conversations because, of course, a war zone is basically an endless lockdown, by the way. So I'm very used to this experience. It's much nicer, this environment, the lockdown that we're in right now, than the kind of lockdowns I was experiencing for many years during my career, whether in Baghdad Bureau or in other places.
Do you have any tips for people who are struggling in lockdown?
Oh, I mean, it is purely about social engagement. I mean, it's the only thing. And also, you know, perhaps finding something that's going to challenge your brain, since you can't, there's nothing, the problem in a lockdown, I think, is that there are no surprises. You get up and you kind of know what your day is going to be. And that's very bad for your brain, very bad for your body as well, to never have a surprise. So I think, you know, trying to physically and mentally challenge yourself is a good idea, even if it's something absolutely impossible. Like I'm sure many people have brought out like the whole of Proust and it's still sitting there on their bedside table, but maybe 2 pages have been got through or something like that. And it will still be there come Christmas. But at least I think the attempt to try and challenge yourself, as well as the constant attempt to try and be socially engaged, is important.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'd like to move our conversation now over to OSINT technology. This is what we talked about when we first met, when we were preparing for this call, and it immediately grabbed my attention. So OSINT technology stands for Open Source Intelligence, OSINT. And so for the audience, OSINT is intelligence derived from data and information available to the general public. But it's not limited to what can be found using Google, but the surface web is a very important component. So for example, in your most recent documentary for BBC Arabic on the spread of COVID-19 in the Middle East, you used an online flight tracker to sort of see which flights were leaving countries. And if you've watched that documentary, you'll know what I'm talking about. How did the BBC Arabic team first start working with open source intelligence?
Well, I mean, it's become a huge advantage over the last 10 years that people just have been dumping so much data and using the internet as a place to keep their stuff, whether it's the open internet or it's the dark web as well, which is another place that you can, do an awful lot of research in. So they've been dumping their data there, not really thinking necessarily all the time about how it can be used. So for a long time, a journalist had a field day being able to really, you could see so much from someone's LinkedIn profile. You could see so much about who they were working with, and then you were matching it up with all of their different businesses that they had to be open about on let's say a UK government site, or probably on a Swiss government site as well. And you were able to draw really helpful conclusions. Now, people are a lot more aware of their privacy and a lot more aware of not dumping all that data on. But there are ways to mine what is out there. And we all are under financial pressure in the media. Nobody wants to pay for their media. We've, spent, since the internet was invented, we've spent a long time making ourselves available for free. So we need to cut corners any way we can in the ways we investigate things. So if we can investigate something from our sofa whilst on lockdown, that's great. And so we initially turned to it because the region that we work in is extremely it's not transparent at all in the way that any of the governments work. So you're constantly looking for somebody's made a mistake, put something online, or perhaps there's a forum that somebody's managed to access that has a really interesting conversation going on it that allows us to then get to a real primary source, a person. And so it's a combination really between what's out there and available to find versus backing that up with real people and speaking to real people to make sure that data is something that is actually being seen on the ground. And actually going beyond that, if you can't get to real people because it's too dangerous for them to speak to you, as is so often the case in our region, then you can actually find their voices already online by looking at social media. And so you can see them, and you can see them verifying certain things for you. Then the next challenge is to check that that tweet and everything they've been doing is real. So you have to trace back, and it takes a lot of work, and you've got to check that the video that they've posted isn't something that was posted 3 years ago and they're just trying to make something of it today. It's a lot of work.
And so walk me through that process of investigative work. So you're alerted to a potential story, and then what's the next step with the team?
So it's almost actually, it's a little bit like probably how you run your science experiments, or at least how I used to. So you'll come up with something that you've seen one or two things happening somewhere, whether it's a flight radar thing that's been posted by somebody, or it's somebody in a port who's taken a picture of a boat leaving that they say has got something dodgy on it. And you form a sort of hypothesis about what you think might have happened. And then you form an anti-hypothesis about the opposite of that, because you need to never give yourself the chance to positively influence your own research. And then in the ideal world, you'll have two teams working on the positive and the anti type of hypothesis, and working out what is true and what is not true, and then bringing together that information and seeing what fits, and inevitably one avenue of your investigation will go further than the other one. We tend to run on an understanding that out of any, let's say we get 10 pitches, and out of every 10 pitches, which is ideas presented to us, we probably choose one to investigate. And then out of every 6 of those that have already gone through the filtration of the 10, I would expect only about 1 in every 6 to actually make it onto air, because the failure rate of investigations is very high. So whether it be that you're wrong, you've been led off in the wrong direction, somebody, there's a dodgy source, we're always having people try to influence us in one way or another. Or it could just be that you can never gather enough evidence. You find that you hit a stumbling block, and you can never gather enough evidence in order to really prove what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of malicious actors there in the process who are trying to maybe throw you off the scent or delay the process. Do you encounter that a lot? What are some examples of that? Yeah,
we get we've been hacked. That's a very extreme version of that. But as you're going along, you'll be trying to speak to people all the way along, and the BBC is a very big name, and people know that which can be a huge advantage in some ways, like governments actually answer the phone when you call, but in many ways it's a disadvantage, because we're there to be a ship that can be manipulated in one way or another, which is why we always have to double guess ourselves and think, okay, so what if this wasn't true? What if what the Egyptian government's saying is true? Let's try and see what this story would look like if that was true. And you try to piece together, and then you realize, oh, actually, no, there's no evidence for their version of the story, but we have a huge amount of evidence for our version of the story. And it's it's hard to maintain that line sometimes, because people can be very charming, very persuasive. They can have a great CV, and you look at them and you investigate them online, and a person is much more likely to sway you than the data at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when we're talking about being swayed either way, I think for a lot of the investigations of your team that I've watched, there is an enormous amount of evidence, and it's very easy to see that that's valid because it's all open source evidence. You can go back and trace it yourself. But I did notice there's a similar team, the BBC Africa Eye, and they have an investigation on YouTube into Turkish ships traveling to Libya. And there's sort of a striking, something that you see immediately when you go to the video, which is the ratio of dislikes to likes on the video. It's almost 50-50. And nearly all of the comments lambast the BBC for focusing on Turkey and not other nations involved in Libya, proclaim fake news. I don't think that's valid at all, but I do wonder how these investigations are decided. How do you decide who to tackle with the documentaries, and how do you deal with those accusations of bias?
Yeah, we're aware of those allegations, and I think we're at our most successful when we're being accused by both sides of being biased from the same story. We get that in many countries. We're seen to be pro-Palestinian and Zionist at the same time. We're seen to be not hard enough on the Iranian government and too hard on the Iranian government. It's really difficult to walk that line, and I can't tell you 100% that we've got the perfect formula for it. And maybe occasionally we have to step back and think, right, how do we balance ourselves out here? Because we've ended up doing 2 or 3 stories in one area because we are quite good at that knowledge. It's not generally because of a bias, as far as I've ever experienced. Then let's see, how can we balance that out? But of course, audiences are very, as you'll know from probably all the media research that you've done, audiences are very tunnel vision, and they'll tend to focus only on the thing that they're seeing right in front of them that someone else has tweeted, and they may not see that you've done another piece that was, pro your community or anti a particular, nothing we do is pro or anti. We're very fair. In fact, we're so fair that sometimes people are really confused by, where is our line? And that's another complaint that we get, that we're not hard enough on people. But ultimately, we just try to lay out the evidence, and the audience can decide for themselves what they, which direction they want, what their opinion is as a result of that.
We have an audience question, actually. Sorry. Do you think that the media gets treated too harshly when it comes to gathering evidence and being accurate and reliable? Or is it usually just around social media kind of area where people send a lot of their hate towards?
Well, we know when we do certain stories that we're going to get a lot of trolling.
Well, I'm so sorry. I apologize on that.
No, don't worry. It's fine. Does it happen to you guys a lot? It's quite weird that we're talking about like media manipulation and that should happen.
Yeah.
I said the word troll and that happened. That's just very weird.
I'm not sure what that, I really don't know.
Okay.
I think we'll just sort of move on.
As an example of how trolling works, is it's a fishing for attention. And often it's not the attention, it's attention for a different reason than what they might portray it to be. When we did, I can think of a couple of stories, examples of where we've had to deal with a lot of online, more difficult criticism that was hard to challenge. And that was the Idlib, we did a story called Idlib Double Tap, which you can find online. There's a short version that's very short, like 3 minutes. And that one, in that story, we were saying that Russia had carried out there was evidence that Russia had carried out a double tap attack on a place in Idlib, which is currently there's an area in Syria. Just a quick recap in case you don't know the situation in Syria right now. There's an area in Syria which is a province called Idlib, and it's really the last stronghold of rebel stronghold against Assad. It's been holding on for a while now. It's been coming up a year that it will have been basically under siege. And they're doing remarkably well, the people who are living in there under the circumstances. We communicate with them regularly. It is a very large area. There are 3 million civilians there. And when we did this story, we were receiving a lot of complaints about the accuracy of the story. And when we actually investigated and had a look at who was behind those complaints, it actually was a group of people who had been repeatedly complaining about the activities of the coverage of the activities of Russia within Syria. And then we can go further and look actually at who those people are and where their funding comes from. And you get to learn an awful lot about where those trolls have come from. They were making some really interesting, almost using the style of an OSINT investigation. So they were taking our piece and then breaking it down shot by shot in some cases to kind of say that we were wrong. And it was really interesting to see the detail that they'd gone into. So we had to pay attention to it. But there's always a story behind the story, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and you mentioned that investigation into the double tap strike in Idlib. Something that really struck me about that video that we were talking about earlier is there's a fascinating scene in the documentary where a cell phone footage from a cell phone around the time of the strike is used because the shadow of a first responder can be used as a sundial to approximate the time that the strike took place. Do you have experts on hand who use these sort of techniques to approximate time and location, or is that something that's really done just within the team? So
I would say the premier place to go and learn about OSINT is to look at an organization called Bellingcat, Bellingcat. And I'd really recommend it as a home for the resources of the world coming together you know, all of these investigative resources that they have checked and checked again, and they feel are reliable, and they work in an open way as well, an open source way, in terms of any criticism of those tools. It can be, everybody will know what that criticism is, and so people can quickly work out how, you know, whether something is reliable or not. There are no secrets with all of those tools, and there are hundreds of them. And I would really recommend to students that, you know, anything that you're investigating and looking at for school, even take a look and see whether there's something there that could bring light onto a subject that you're looking at. I know that you guys are really interested in climate change, and they've done some brilliant stuff on climate change, and using those tools, you can have you know yourself sitting there in a classroom and you can solve something, because there's, you know, 20 brains in one room, which is much better than us journalists. So what the point that I was trying to make is, no, we're not experts, and we can't be, because we don't know what tools we're going to need for each of these different things. So with Idlib, we ended up having to hire a forensic weapons expert, and that person was able to look at the tiny bits of fragments that were still available on the ground in all the pictures, and say to us what type of a shell he thought it was. Now that guy we had to pay, although he would have done it for free, I have to say, because he's so passionate about the subject, but we paid him. But for the sundial thing, frankly, we had to learn, and we've had to learn several other things. So there's a really interesting geolocation tool that is offered by Google, that enables you to match up a picture of a satellite picture with an actual sort of picture taken of a landscape, and you'll see that in some of the Africa Eye investigations. There's one called Anatomy of a Killing. Amnesty uses it when it's doing human rights investigations, when it's trying to find out, can they verify where something happened? And you can't rely on the word of social media. You can't rely on the word of witnesses even, because everybody is coming with an agenda. Yeah. So it's far better if you can do that work yourself, and that's often teaching yourself how to use something.
And so talking about that, I mean, it must be very tricky for someone like yourself who was so used to working on the ground. I mean, you're so well accustomed to working on the ground. You basically wrote the book on it, with how to avoid being killed in a war zone. And yet 3 years ago, you transitioned to a system where you're largely working on the other side of the world in the UK, working remotely to try and piece together evidence. How was that transition? Was that something very tricky to do, or was it a bit of a relief?
It is tricky, but I would say that I've always worked across a region, and I've never kind of only done a local beat, or I haven't since I was very young. I haven't only done a local beat since I was very young. And so I've always needed to be working across time zones and across languages often. And that inevitably means that I'm working remotely with people, even if they're just one town along. So it's different in some ways, and it's not different in others. I think the real difference is you're spending a lot less time speaking to people on the phone, trying to piece something together, trying to send somebody to go to a ministry to find something, where rather than, you know, hiring somebody who may be able to find that information out through mining all sorts of background data that they can find legally, I should say, because you're not allowed to hack stuff. Anything that you know, people have left around, basically. And I should actually say that some people are doing open source stuff, and they're encouraging and paying for, some media are paying for hackers to do bad stuff. Obviously, sometimes it leads to some really interesting and valid stories, but I feel quite strongly that you shouldn't be paying for people to be hacking anything. Yeah. Very criminal.
I think another thing that really piqued my interest when we started talking about this sort of remote investigative journalism was how similar it is to the situation that nearly everyone is experiencing at the moment with the lockdowns across the world with COVID-19. It seems as though the way that BBC Arabic has sort of transitioned to operating is very well suited. Has there been much of a change for you since the lockdown in terms of getting work done?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there has been, because when brains come in, you know, each of the team that we work with, we have about 10 people in our team, let's say, on a good day. If there are 4 or 5 of us working on one project, we'll move a story on very fast if we're all working on it together. And there is something different about being in the same room for that. But, you know, we're working with all sorts of tools online now to try and replicate that. But it's not quite the same, and it doesn't move as fast. Things are definitely taking a lot longer.
Do you see... Sorry, go on, Ronnie.
We have an audience question kind of based around that. So do you have any advice for aspiring journalists since the field is changing so quickly? And then, like, what would that future look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, we are open to everybody around the world who works in media. Very few of us are actually allowed to and paid to work on original journalism. And that's brilliant news, because let's say 90% of everything you see in the media comes from a press release, usually, okay? And then 10%, well, actually, I'll put it more like another 6% comes from perhaps an original sit-down interview, and you get something new from that sit-down interview. And there's a very small amount at the top of investigative journalism where someone is really mining, trying to find something new and taking something forward. And those stories come from access and come from understanding. Those are the two things that take which form the basis of all investigative work. Access and understanding. So either you have access uniquely to something that nobody else can access, or very few people can access, or you have an understanding of something that nobody else has. Now, there is a huge opportunity there for people who perhaps have a bit more time, a bit more enthusiasm, and a bit more energy to look at a story they're interested in, to use free tools that are available online, and to produce an original investigation that you could come to us or Bellingcat or other places. And in my day, I had to travel to Baghdad to find the story. Well, now you could sit where you are in Zug, and you could go to Baghdad. You could perhaps find somebody in a forum online who was interested like you and spoke the right language, but maybe you could bring something to that too. Maybe you have a skill you don't realize you have. And that's sort of why when I was chatting with Lucas and Ronnie and Fabrizio before this, I thought this would be an appropriate thing to talk about, because I really feel it's a really accessible area of journalism, and there's nothing to stop you. The only thing between you and a really great story that will get you into being a journalist is curiosity. And we work with a lot of students, and you know, a lot of students come to us with great ideas because they've just become obsessed with something, and they've seen something that's wrong, and they want to show us, and we're like, whoa, that's a very interesting story, tell us more.
So very much like how you felt it was wrong that there was a disjunction between what your friends at the war zone were saying and what the media were saying back in 2003. It's very much the same now, except we don't have to travel to the Middle East to get started. Yeah. There's a similar question that we've got from the audience here, which is, I suppose, if we're suggesting that people my age and older and younger really get involved in journalism by going at it themselves, how can people identify that something they read or see is valid? I mean, even if we just talk about the news, how do you identify that an article that you read is valid and has been sourced correctly? What are your tips coming from a journalist to spot fake news in that sense?
Well, gosh, there are so many things. There's actually a great area on the BBC website. If you look up fake news toolbox, I think that's what you have to look up. But it's got some really great tools in there. Some of them are probably the same ones that Bellingcat uses. So we can start with something simple like a picture. There's a huge problem because when there's a good picture, people people come back to it, and they come back to it, and it's not easy to tell that something's dated. You know, it's not in black and white. It's just a few years ago. The pixelation is not too different. So you can reverse search for images. You can reverse search even for video. You can pull data off from a video and search for that data from the video. That's actually very simple to do. So simple that me, as a stupid, like quite senior producer, I know how to do that, whereas I don't do a lot of the other hands-on work of the research. And then in terms of fake news and looking out for fake news, if it sounds a bit odd, or if it sounds a bit too good to be true, and if there's something in you that says this is just a really weird story, then usually it is a fake news story. You can tell by how many ads might be on the story, how many downloadable links there are on the story, whether it's something that's been done for money. But also you can search for, if there's a quote, you can search for the individual and the quote and see who is this individual, who is that quote, does that quote exist elsewhere? There's a lot of different things you could do, but please remain skeptical, because there's a lot of, even to the very end of every single one of our own documentaries and every news piece I've ever worked on, we usually find one or two things within the story in the last day that are wrong, you know, and thank goodness for editors who have that final check. But there's a lot out there. I'm sure each one of you has read a story about something that you care about and been like, that's not correct. I bet that's happened to most of you. And that is true, unfortunately, of most stories. So yeah, there's fake news, which is really entirely meant to disrupt your thinking. But then there's also just bad journalism, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would like to start closing up the conversation now. We're going to move to audience questions. I do have one final question though. We have a lot of negativity, I think, when we talk about the state of journalism and journalism moving forward. You know, there's paywalls going up on nearly every decent website, and journalists seem to be facing more and more challenges every day. But I would like to ask you what change you're most excited to see coming in journalism in the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think the accessibility of it now, I'm sorry to say the same thing again, really, but there really was a difficulty. You had to be in the room in order to be taken seriously as a journalist. You don't need to be in the room now. You can be outside the room, and you can pick and choose your outlets who are desperate for original journalism, and you can go to them and you can say, I've got something original that I've bothered to produce here, and they will be way more open to you than they used to be, because they just don't have the budgets to do it themselves. So I think that is a huge opportunity. I also think that after coronavirus, that we've all had to learn, and I've always been like this, I much prefer working with local teams on the ground. I feel there's a huge advantage with that. But a lot of my colleagues at the BBC, and a lot of my experience when I used to live abroad and was trying to get stuff commissioned, is that local teams didn't used to be trusted. And we used to be constantly sending very expensive cameramen from England who've never been to a country to go and film something, or from the States. Sometimes we'd, you know, get so desperate we'd be flying someone from LA for like $2,000. That's not going to happen so much now. So you're all from really interesting places. And I bet there's a story you can tell from where you live that you know, we don't have the money to do, and we can't do under Corona. So that is another opportunity that's particular to this time.
That's a really fascinating insight. Thank you. It's very, very motivational. I think there's silver linings for sure. I think we're going to open it up now, and I'll pass over to Fabrizio to introduce the next section of our talk. But thank you so much, Rosie, for chatting to us for the last 45 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much, Rosie. It's been very insightful to hear, get a bit of a behind-the-scenes look of how journalism works. This is the end of our 45-minute Q&A session with Rosie. But if you've got any further questions that you'd like to ask personally, then please stick around in the Zoom call. So will she. You can ask your questions for around another 15 minutes. Should you decide to leave, please turn on your cameras and wave to her just to show your appreciation and to thank her for taking the time to join us here tonight for another installment of YFS in Conversation with. And of course, we've got more sessions coming up next week at 3 o'clock. We have our next YFS in Conversation with the science behind stress. But once again, thank you so much to you, Rosie. Thank you so much for all of you attending. You can stay in the call. We'll be around for another 15 minutes where you can ask your personal questions.
There are some pretty good articles about Zoom hacking you might want to look up as well, in case that was what happened.
I think it was. Our apologies again. We haven't really experienced.
I think it's because you publicly advertised, so that's what happens. Like you make yourself a target, and that it's I'm hoping that's what happened.
Yeah. It definitely was a hack. Like the amount of people trying to log in at the same time was like 20 people, and we were removing them as quickly as they were coming in. So
oh, really?
Yeah, so it definitely was.
And it certainly adds.
Happened to you before?
No, definitely not.
Sorry about
that. Certainly adds a bit of excitement to it. I certainly wasn't expecting that. Do you get a lot of that when you're working through stories, that there are sort of scary moments?
I got really targeted at one point when I was working. Well, I'm still working on worker stories in the Gulf region, and it's considered a matter of national security. And so I got targeted. And I've talked about this, I think, in the past, you guys. But there's a good article by Amnesty, and it's called. So if you look up Amnesty and Kingfish, but spelled with PHI, Kingfish, you'll see like a long article about what happened to me. But the stupid thing is I was actually hacked whilst I was doing an investigation into surveillance, cyber surveillance. So I felt like such an idiot, but it could happen to anyone.
They actually have a series of audience questions kind of around maybe the more dangerous parts of being a journalist. So how's like your investigative work, has it ever led to a life-threatening or dangerous situation, and has your life ever been in physical danger as well?
That has happened to me. My worst experiences were just when I was starting out, as I think a lot of people will usually tell you, where I was just a bit overly confident and not aware of the limitations, and sometimes ignoring the advice of the people that I had hired to kind of help me. So there's one incident that comes to mind where we had got this amazing interview at the military base, an interview so many people wanted. And so I was driving up in Basra through, and there was a crossroads. I had to go through a crossroads in order to get to the military base. And there were lots of tires burning and people protesting. But by this time, this was happening everywhere where I was. And so I was like, oh, we'll be fine. Come on, keep going. And in my car, I had a guy who was a father and a provider to 8 children. And he was like, you know what? I get a funny feeling about this one. And I don't want to go. I said, don't be silly. Come on, you've got to do it. Let's go. And we slowed down to ask somebody at his request. He said, can we ask that guy what it's like up there? Because we were just going to zoom through it like 90 miles an hour. And he slowed down, and this guy came over, and he had 2 grenades on his hand, and he put them through the window, because I had my window open to talk to him. And I'm sitting there looking pretty, like this. And in the middle of Basra, the only like blonde person in Basra, basically without a headscarf on. And he got very, very angry. And luckily my friend reached over and opened the door, and I kicked the door open, and he pushed away. And luckily the grenades didn't fall into the car. but yeah, always listen to the locals. They know what they're doing.
My God, yeah. And the investigative work that you did in the Middle East when you were on the ground, was there a lot of procedures to try and prevent events like that happening, or were you very much on your own? If you have the story, you pursue the story.
When I was working in those days, there were none of the safety things in place to help us, high risk teams. I mean, right now, my job, I fill out 40-page security forms every time we move because of coronavirus. All of the contingency plans, all of the quarantine plans. I mean, it's ridiculous, I have to say. I mean, not ridiculous as in ridiculously long, but also makes you think. You think about things that you hadn't thought about if you hadn't had to fill out the form, which is good. And sometimes it's made me realize we can't do a story because it's just too risky. So that's that. But in my day, I was by myself. I was earning $10 a day, and I was paying my translator $12 a day. And I chose him because he was really big. Like, he had gone to the gym a lot. He was probably on masses of steroids, who knows? But he just looked like he might protect me a bit better than the next translator.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, no, there was nothing in place to protect me in those days. But these days, yeah, we were super cautious, and even down to the risks of being hacked. We'll go through a long process to make sure that cyber security is properly in place, because that is a hugely vulnerable area. And then people can really manipulate you if they get hold of stuff on your computer, let alone stealing from you, but they can get hold of private information and use that to manipulate you. And it's a very difficult situation.
Yeah. We've got another audience question here. I would like to remind people, you can raise your hand, the raise hand function, and ask Rosie a question yourself in person now. I do have one more question from the audience. There's one about the treatment of the media, sort of in public opinion. Do you think it gets treated too harshly when it comes to being accurate and reliable?
I don't know. We're very hated. Journalists are really hated, especially the coverage of Brexit, the last, what feels like decade, but it's probably only 3 years. That if somebody's not saying what you want them to say, then you're going to probably think they're inaccurate, because we all live in these bubbles. And one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, and that's my main problem usually. We just try our best to lay it all out. I do think, though, that the media probably suffers a little bit from not being able to form enough of an opinion sometimes, and I think that is something that is thrown at the BBC a bit, that we should form more of an opinion, and when something is wrong, we should stand against it. We're not allowed to. That's not something the BBC is allowed to do by its own charter, but it does leave us vulnerable to people thinking that we're not on their side, or everybody thinking we're not on their side. Yeah.
There's one more question I actually had personally, where you were talking about sometimes the extreme danger that you found yourselves in on the ground in the Middle East. Now you're working from home in London. Do you ever miss it? Do you ever miss the thrill of it? You're really drilling at home now.
I do. I really miss being on the ground, and I'm in management now, and I don't recommend it. I keep being pushed to go higher, and I'm not going any higher. I'm filling out enough forms as it is. I was supposed to go and make a film for the first time in years this summer. I have a great film, but now I'm having to do the whole thing remotely. So it's really depressing not getting to travel as much as I used to. On the other hand, I get a chance to work with some really interesting young people who come into, my world with a good story, and then I get to watch them have a great, hopefully beginning of a great career, and that's very satisfying as well. But it's just a slightly different thing. So it's you also, there is the more you spend in stress and danger, the less stressed and dangerous it feels. So there does come a point where it's actually quite sensible in your career to go, let's just not go there for a while, because you start, whereas when you first arrived, you might have found something too dangerous to do. By the time you've been there for 10 months, your judgment has changed and you will be like, it's not that dangerous. I've done it 50 times before. But actually it is just as dangerous as when you first arrived. It's just that you've got used to it.
Yeah. I remember going into Zurich a couple years ago before the first youth forum that we did to watch your film, The Workers' Cup. And it was absolutely fabulous. If anyone hasn't seen it, you can rent it on Vimeo online. It's a fabulous film in Qatar. And you mentioned there that you're working on a new film. Can we get any sneak peeks or any clues?
That one's the top. That particular one's top secret. But we're working on lots of films. So let me think of one that I can tell you about. Oh, it's not very uplifting. No, there's most of the work I do is not very uplifting. What can I tell you about that?
Well, tell us a little bit about your experience on the Workers' Cup then.
Yes. So Workers' Cup is something which could not have been done remotely. I'm trying to do, right now, I'm trying to make stories about what's going on in camps, inside worker camps around the region. I've been trying since the first day that we heard about Corona. Everybody is terrified, and you cannot do it remotely. It's only through personal relationships that you can gain access to these places. And so, yeah, that's been a good lesson, actually, a big difference. But in order to gain access to the camp that we gained access to in Qatar for months and even year and a half on end, I built up relationships with people right at the top of the tree in Qatar. Probably took 10 years of telling them that I'm not going to damage their reputation, before they believed me and looked at my body of work, and then they let us in. Of course, it didn't work out quite so well. I had to leave the country because I lost a lot of business after being associated with the film. But ultimately, the film's not been it's not been censored in Qatar. We have had a couple of attempted hackings, but it was very minor, really, compared to what could have happened. And we were able, with the help of a charity, we were able to release the film for free in Qatar for the last 6 months. And it's been massively watched online by their very small population. So even a few thousand views over there is a very big deal. And so that's been really satisfying. And that, I think, we were able to balance our view of the migrant worker experience, because we'd had so much time on the ground and understood things from both sides of, not both sides, but from all sides. The situation for migrant workers wasn't black and white. They want to be there, and it's much more complex than that. And luckily, the film gave us the opportunity to tell a longer story rather than a 3-minute news piece.
And my final question for this evening, and I think we'll wrap it up. We've got this from the audience. It's, what was the most eye-opening situation or story that you experienced while working as a journalist? So as a journalist, the thing that, yeah, I suppose eye-opening is the best way to describe it.
I can't really, you know what, it's really hard for me to pin something down, but probably the journalism that I think I did that affected the most amount of people was something called Weapons of Mass Surveillance. It's also available on BBC for free. And that was looking at the technology, the cyber surveillance tools that were being sold by the West to the Middle East to spy on their populations in places where there was no legal framework to prevent that and to prevent the action that people were taking as a result of the information they were given. And that it was eye-opening for a number of reasons. I met all of these crazy hackers and people who work as developers, and it was so interesting getting to know this community. Every single person who worked in that kind of work had a certain type of personality. I just have still to this day really struggled to work out how to work with them. But they're very unique, amazing, brilliant individuals. you know, some of them doing bad and some of them doing good. And that was extremely eye-opening to meet this type of person who is so influential in our lives. But you know, could they do their work from a sofa? For sure, they can do it all under Corona. And in the end, a part of BAE Systems was closed down as a result of the findings of the documentary. So that was really satisfying and quite scary as well, thinking that we put, I think it was 126 people out of jobs, but you know what they'd been doing was putting a lot of millions of people's lives in danger. So
wow, yeah. And that was Weapons of Mass Surveillance. That's available on the BBC.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Look, I think we're going to have to close up the call for this evening. It's been a pleasure having you, to be able to talk to you. It's been really eye-opening, and I would suggest for anyone here who hasn't seen some of Rosie's work, the links are out there. They've been sent to the ISDL community, and some of them are really, really fabulous. I would personally recommend The Workers' Cup. I think it made a really strong personal impact on me. I love that film, so I would really suggest checking out some of that work. But for now, thank you so much. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all for coming on a warm, sunny evening in Switzerland. And for sticking through the hacking.
Yeah, apologies for that again.
I'm not easily shocked, luckily.
Yeah, I think if we were to have any speaker to deal with it, I think we would have chosen you. Fairly pales in comparison to Iraq, I'm sure.
So who's your next speaker? They're talking about stress.
Yeah, next Monday, Professor Dr. Jonas Boachek, he'll be joining us, and as you said, very appropriate, especially I think for a lot of students, and a lot of people are stuck at home right now. Some might feel like the world is just coming in on them, so very interesting to talk to him. Yeah, we're really quite honored to have this opportunity to talk with world-renowned experts from a variety of different fields, you know, like you, to give our students an insight into what the world is like, and just also give them an opportunity to once again ask you questions. It's quite incredible. So thank you again for coming so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, the stress, I mean, getting to know those tools for dealing with stress when you're younger is super valuable. I think definitely that wasn't available when I was your age in an easy way anyway. So it's really great. I know that well-being is a much bigger part of what you do now.
Is there much support set up for journalists who have been in war zones to deal with trauma or PTSD? Quite
newly, actually. Do you guys remember the story of Grenfell Tower? It was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
In the UK. That strangely, to a lot of very hard-bitten journalists, they all happened to live. The BBC used to be very close to that tower. I used to live near that tower. A lot of people from the BBC lived near there, and that caused a huge change in the way we deal with well-being at the BBC. And they've set aside like a huge room filled with board games and kind of quiet, squishy things that you can sit in if you're feeling stressed.
Wow.
And they've assigned we have a high risk advisor now whose entire thing is about the risk to your mental health as opposed to your physical risk.
Yeah, that's really interesting that something in the UK sparked that sort of redesign.
Yeah, it's the thing closest to home, isn't it?
Yeah.